Thomas Darcy and the rebel leaders were tricked into disbanding their forces when King Henry VIII dispatched an envoy carrying a royal wax-sealed pardon to the north. The old nobleman believed that this paper pledging exemption from prosecution would help him retain thousands of acres of land threatened with confiscation. As soon as the rioters discarded their weapons, the king immediately tore up the pardon and launched a bloody purge by hanging hundreds of people. Thomas Darcy was thrown onto a prisoner cart and escorted to the capital to face the ultimate punishment. At the Tower Hill execution ground, the 70-year-old general was forced to place his neck on a wooden block before the executioner swung an axe to completely sever his head. Old aristocratic families formed the absolute foundation of political and military power in northern England. Through generations of strategic landholding, they maintained direct control over local courts and regional armies. This regional authority was crucial, as the king's influence in the north was traditionally weaker than in London. The Darcy family exemplified this power, managing massive estates across Lincolnshire and Yorkshire. Born around 1467, Thomas Darcy entered this powerful hierarchy as the only son of Sir William Darcy and Euphemia Langton. Darcy grew up during the Wars of the Roses, a violent era of dynastic conflict over the English throne. His home region of Yorkshire held deep, established loyalties to the House of York and King Richard III. This strong regional allegiance created a significant political crisis after the Battle of Bosworth in 1485. Henry Tudor defeated Richard to claim the crown, establishing an entirely new royal dynasty. However, the new king quickly realized that military victory alone did not instantly secure the loyalty of the entire nation. King Henry VII faced the complex challenge of governing northern territories that were highly reluctant to accept his new rule. He needed to manage powerful aristocratic families who possessed their own armed retainers and had served his former enemies. Thomas Darcy had to navigate this tense political landscape carefully to preserve his family's influence. Northern England remained particularly volatile, complicated by slow communication with London and the ever-present danger along the Scottish border. Yorkist sympathies had not disappeared simply because Richard III had been killed, meaning Darcy had to decide where he stood. Rather than tying his future to the defeated Yorkist establishment, he chose to serve Henry VII. This was a practical political decision, but it became the foundation of his career. Darcy would devote a lifetime to helping a new dynasty establish control over precisely the kind of region where Tudor rule was most vulnerable. His usefulness came partly from the military system of the period, since England did not maintain a large permanent national army in the modern sense. When the king needed troops, he depended heavily on nobles and regional gentlemen to recruit them. One important mechanism was the indenture system. A nobleman could enter into a formal military agreement with the crown and promise to provide a specified number of fighting men. The nobleman was responsible for assembling them, equipping them, organizing them, and, at least initially, financing their service. This system gave men like Darcy enormous importance. The government in London could issue commands, but it needed local power brokers who actually knew where soldiers could be found and who possessed the money and authority necessary to mobilize them. In 1492, Darcy contracted to serve Henry VII during an English expedition to France connected with the siege of Boulogne. His obligation was substantial. He was expected to provide 1,000 men. That meant much more than appearing personally on a battlefield, as Darcy had to organize a military force. Recruitment required local connections, while weapons, horses, clothing, provisions, and wages required money. The crown might later reimburse part of these costs according to the number of men actually serving, but Darcy first had to possess enough resources to make the force exist. A relationship was therefore developing between Darcy and the Tudor monarchy that was based on mutual usefulness. The king gave Darcy offices, authority, recognition, and access to royal resources. Darcy gave the king's soldiers administration and control in regions where the central government could not easily impose its will directly. The Scottish border made Darcy even more valuable. The Anglo-Scottish frontier was not simply a clean political boundary separating two stable states. It was an area where local conflict, raiding, cattle theft, kidnapping, revenge attacks, and private violence were persistent problems. Groups commonly known as border reivers crossed the frontier for livestock and plunder, while local families could maintain feuds lasting for generations. Maintaining royal authority there required more than ceremonial status. Officials needed armed force, local knowledge, and a willingness to use severe punishment. Darcy developed his reputation in this environment. In 1497, James IV of Scotland attacked Norham Castle in Northumberland. Darcy joined Thomas Howard, Earl of Surrey, in the English response. English forces relieved the castle and forced the Scots to withdraw. Darcy's military service added to the reputation he was already building. He had been made a Knight Bachelor and was subsequently raised to the battlefield rank of Knight Banneret. More important than the titles themselves was what followed. By 1498, Henry VII appointed Darcy captain of Berwick-upon-Tweed. Berwick was one of England's most strategically important frontier positions. Control of the town had changed between England and Scotland repeatedly during earlier centuries, and England spent heavily on its fortifications. Darcy remained associated with the command of Berwick until 1515. His job was not limited to waiting for a Scottish invasion. Frontier government involved military defense, policing, legal disputes, negotiations, and the suppression of armed crime. Darcy imposed strict discipline. In an area where conventional courts could be slow or ineffective, authorities sometimes relied on summary punishment. Border offenders and insurgents could face execution without the kind of lengthy legal process that would have been more normal elsewhere. Darcy also served as Warden of the East and Middle Marches. These offices placed him at the center of frontier administration. Marcher officials dealt with cross-border disputes, raids, stolen property, local violence, and diplomatic contacts with Scottish representatives. The work required a combination of force and negotiation. One day might involve organizing troops against raiders, while another could involve a court attempting to settle claims between families living on opposite sides of the border. Darcy's authority therefore became broader than that of a conventional soldier, as he was becoming a military administrator. His loyalty to the Tudor regime was also demonstrated far from Scotland. In 1497, the Cornish Rebellion brought thousands of protesters toward London. The rising had been triggered by opposition to taxation, particularly money demanded by the crown for military purposes. For Henry VII, however, the march represented a direct threat to royal authority. Darcy served as one of the commanders involved in suppressing the rebels at the Battle of Blackheath. There was no sign at this stage of the sympathy for large-scale resistance that would later be associated with his name. Darcy belonged firmly to the governing order. When ordinary subjects challenged royal policy through armed mobilization, he helped defeat them. The same pattern appeared during the disturbances associated with Perkin Warbeck, the pretender who claimed to be Richard, Duke of York, one of the missing princes in the Tower. Warbeck attracted support in several regions and became a serious political problem for Henry VII. After these rebellions were crushed, Darcy was appointed as one of the royal commissioners responsible for imposing financial penalties on people who had supported them. His task was not reconciliation. It was punishment and the restoration of royal control. By this point, Darcy had become exactly the type of man Henry VII needed. Wealthy enough to operate independently, militarily experienced, deeply connected to northern society, and prepared to enforce royal authority against both foreign enemies and domestic opposition. Henry VII rewarded that usefulness by giving him increasingly important administrative positions. Darcy became constable and receiver general of several strategically important northern castles and estates, including Bamberg, Middleham, Richmond, and Sheriff Hutton. Sheriff Hutton carried particular significance. It had been closely associated with Richard III and his northern administration. Control of such a place gave Darcy access not only to a fortress, but to the surrounding machinery of government. As Receiver General, Darcy dealt with revenue, and as a royal officer, he exercised administrative influence. His position connected military command with taxation, legal authority, and management of royal property. He also became Receiver General for lands belonging to the Duke of York, the young Prince Henry. That brought Darcy into direct administrative contact with the prince, who would become Henry VIII. When Henry VII died in 1509 and his son inherited the throne, Darcy, therefore, was not an unknown northern nobleman seeking favor from a new monarch. He was already an experienced servant of the dynasty with decades of military and governmental work behind him. Henry VIII initially rewarded him accordingly. Darcy was summoned to Parliament and raised to the peerage as Baron Darcy of Darcy, also known through his principal residence as Baron Darcy of Templehurst. A peerage gave him a permanent place among the political elite of the kingdom. His authority was no longer merely local or military. He now participated directly in national political life through the House of Lords. In the same year, Darcy entered the Order of the Garter. Membership in the Garter was one of the highest honors a monarch could bestow upon an English nobleman. The order admitted only a small group of leading men, connecting aristocratic status, military honor, and personal loyalty to the sovereign. For Darcy, the honor reinforced a belief that would later become extremely important. He did not see himself as an ordinary official whose authority existed only because the king temporarily employed him. He had served the Tudors through war, rebellion, border conflict, and political transition. He had spent his own money raising troops for them. He had governed some of their most difficult territory. His loyalty had been demonstrated repeatedly, and he expected that service to carry political weight. Henry VIII continued expanding his authority. Darcy became Chief Justice of the forests north of the River Trent. Forest law was not simply about trees or hunting, as royal forests were legally defined territories governed by special regulations concerning animals, timber, land use, and access. The office therefore gave Darcy significant judicial and economic authority across a large part of northern England. His military usefulness also continued. In 1511, Henry VIII planned to assist Ferdinand of Aragon in a campaign supposedly directed against Muslim territory in North Africa. Darcy was appointed to lead an English force of around 1,100 archers and was given naval command for the expedition. The operation became a political and logistical disappointment. Ferdinand redirected his strategy, and the English troops found themselves stranded in Spain rather than participating in the campaign they had expected. Darcy once again had to use his own resources to help pay and supply the soldiers before returning them to England. The failure of the expedition did not destroy his standing. When Henry VIII invaded France in 1513, Darcy again mobilized men from his northern estates. Hundreds of archers and billmen were raised through the networks under his control. They served during the campaign that included the siege of Terouanne, and the engagement later remembered as the Battle of the Spurs. By the same period, Darcy had entered the Privy Council. He had now reached the highest level of political influence available beneath the royal family itself. He possessed a peerage, a place in the Order of the Garter, major military offices, regional judicial authority, extensive estates, and direct access to royal government. But Darcy's power in Yorkshire depended on something more personal than official appointments. Like many powerful nobles of the period, he operated through the system often described as bastard feudalism. Instead of relying only on traditional feudal obligations based on landholding, a magnate maintained networks of retainers who served him in return for wages, protection, influence, and patronage. One part of this relationship was known as livery. Darcy's followers could wear clothing or badges identifying them with his household, particularly the Darcy emblem of the buck's head. These men formed a visible political and military network spread across northern communities. The second element was maintenance. A powerful lord did not simply pay his followers, he protected them. If a retainer became involved in a legal dispute or faced criminal accusations, the lord might use his influence over sheriffs, juries, local officials, or neighboring landholders to shape the outcome. The system could make justice highly unequal. A man without a powerful patron faced the law alone, while a man protected by a magnate such as Darcy entered court with an entire political network behind him. This arrangement gave Darcy something approaching a private regional government. Thousands of people depended upon relationships tied to his household. His tenants relied on his estates. Soldiers depended on him for employment. Local gentlemen sought his patronage. Officials knew the weight his name carried. When military forces were needed, he could summon men rapidly because the structure already existed. For the Tudor monarchy, this was useful. London did not have to maintain thousands of permanent royal officials and soldiers across Yorkshire because Darcy's own network performed many of the same functions. But the arrangement also contained a serious contradiction. The crown needed powerful regional nobles because it lacked the administrative capacity to govern every part of England directly. Yet every office, soldier, and retainer accumulated by those nobles made them capable of acting independently. For decades, this contradiction caused little trouble because Darcy and the Tudor kings wanted broadly the same thing: political order, obedience, secure borders, and the survival of the monarchy. By the early 16th century, Thomas Darcy had therefore become one of the strongest representatives of Tudor authority in northern England. He had fought foreign enemies, crushed domestic rebels, managed strategic castles, raised armies, financed royal campaigns, judged disputes, and helped impose the king's authority across territories far from London. His identity was built around service to the crown, but it was also built around an older political system in which powerful nobles expected status, consultation, and respect in exchange for that service. For nearly 40 years, the monarchy and Thomas Darcy had benefited from the same system. During the 1530s, Henry VIII began changing that system. And almost everything Darcy believed he had spent his life defending would soon be placed under pressure. By the beginning of the 1530s, Thomas Darcy had spent most of his life defending royal authority. He had served Henry VII, helped stabilize the Tudor dynasty, fought rebels, commanded on the Scottish border, raised armies for foreign campaigns, and held some of the most important offices in northern England. He was conservative, hierarchical, and deeply attached to the existing political order. That was exactly why the changes imposed by Henry VIII became so dangerous for him. Darcy was not naturally attracted to rebellion. He had spent decades suppressing it. But he believed monarchy operated within an established framework. The king ruled, the nobility served, the church protected the spiritual order, and ancient institutions gave local communities stability. Henry VIII's government increasingly challenged all of those assumptions at once. The first major conflict was religious. Henry VIII's attempt to end his marriage to Catherine of Aragon gradually developed into a much larger confrontation with Rome. When papal approval for the annulment could not be obtained, the king moved toward removing papal authority from England entirely. For Darcy, this was not a technical dispute over royal marriage. He was an elderly Catholic nobleman, formed by a medieval political culture in which the church was not separate from daily government, law, charity, landholding, and social order. The Pope's authority had existed throughout Darcy's entire life. Bishops sat in Parliament, Monasteries controlled enormous estates. Religious institutions provided education, charity, employment, and pensions. Noble families funded churches and masses, partly because they believed those acts affected the fate of their souls after death. The king's break with Rome therefore challenged something much larger than the identity of Henry VIII's wife. Darcy openly resisted the idea that the monarch should control spiritual matters. During a critical parliamentary debate in 1532, the Duke of Norfolk announced the principle that royal authority extended into matters concerning marriage and religion. Darcy objected publicly in the House of Lords. He argued that questions concerning matrimony and the soul belonged to spiritual authorities rather than to the secular jurisdiction of the king. Coming from a noble who had served the Tudors his entire adult life, this was a remarkable act. Darcy was not complaining privately at Templehurst. He was challenging the direction of royal policy inside Parliament. Henry VIII did not forget it. Darcy's relationship with the court deteriorated, and his freedom to return to the north was restricted for extended periods. This mattered because Darcy's political strength depended on personal presence. His authority in Yorkshire was based on continual interaction with tenants, retainers, local officials, gentlemen, clergy, military officers, and neighboring nobles. Keeping him near London weakened that network. It also deepened his resentment. He had functioned for years, almost as a regional governor. Now a new generation of administrators in Westminster was centralizing authority and treating men like him less as political partners and more as subjects expected to obey instructions. At the center of that new system stood Thomas Cromwell. Cromwell represented almost everything Darcy disliked about the direction of Tudor government. The contrast between the two men was striking. Darcy came from an aristocratic family whose claims to status stretched back for centuries. His authority had been built through inherited land, military service, regional influence, and personal loyalty between noble households. Cromwell came from far more modest origins. His father was associated with blacksmithing, brewing, and tavern keeping in Putney. Yet through legal skill, administrative ability, and royal favor, Cromwell had risen to become one of the most powerful men in England. To Henry VIII, Cromwell was valuable precisely because he did not depend on an ancient independent power base. His position came from the king. That made him the ideal architect of centralization. Cromwell developed administrative systems that allowed the crown to reach deeper into local government, religious institutions, property ownership, and political speech. From Darcy's perspective, this was not merely the promotion of an ambitious commoner. It represented the replacement of the political system that had given the old nobility its authority. The religious break became formal. Through a series of parliamentary measures, Henry VIII rejected papal supremacy and eventually declared himself supreme head of the Church of England. For Darcy, the implications were severe. A king whom he had served as a temporal ruler was now claiming authority over an institution Darcy believed belonged to a different spiritual jurisdiction. Then the government moved against the monasteries. This was the issue that transformed religious disagreement into a social crisis throughout northern England. Modern discussions of the dissolution of the monasteries often focus on the enormous wealth possessed by religious houses. That wealth was certainly important. Monasteries controlled land, livestock, buildings, precious objects, and substantial agricultural revenues. But in northern England, their importance went much further. Large houses such as Fountains Abbey, Revaux Abbey, and Gervaux Abbey were deeply integrated into the regional economy. They were major landowners and major participants in the wool trade. They employed workers, rented land to farmers, purchased local products, supported craftsmen, and circulated money through communities that had relatively little direct contact with London. Many tenants held land from monasteries under long-established arrangements. These relationships were often more stable than the arrangements that followed confiscation. When the crown began dissolving smaller religious houses in 1536, their property did not simply disappear. The government took control of it and increasingly transferred or sold monastic lands to new owners. These owners did not necessarily feel bound by the same local customs. Some wanted greater returns from the land. Rents could rise. Common land could be enclosed. Agricultural priorities could change. Tenants who had lived under older arrangements suddenly faced landlords focused more aggressively on maximizing income. This created fear even before Evolve Monastery had been closed. People could see the direction of policy. The monasteries also provided services that the Tudor state was not prepared to replace. They distributed food and alms. Some supported schools and cared for the sick. Travelers could receive hospitality. Roads and bridges could benefit from religious funding. For poorer communities, the removal of a monastery could therefore mean losing several different forms of support simultaneously. One system was particularly important to older people, the Kurodi. Under various forms of Kurodi arrangements, an individual could provide money or property to a religious house in exchange for maintenance later in life. Depending on the agreement, this could include food, accommodation, fuel, clothing, or other necessities. It functioned, in effect, as a form of private pension. When monasteries were dissolved, these arrangements became vulnerable. For elderly people who had planned their final years around monastic support, religious reform was not an abstract theological question. It threatened food, shelter, and security. The same policy affected the nobility in a different way. Families like the Darcys had been giving money and property to religious institutions for generations. One important purpose was to finance prayers for deceased relatives. According to Catholic teaching of the period, many souls passed through purgatory before reaching heaven. Masses and prayers offered for the dead were believed to help those souls. Wealthy families established chantries in which clergy regularly prayed for specific relatives. Darcy had grown up believing that this system mattered. His ancestors had contributed property and money so that religious communities would remember them through prayer. Those arrangements created a spiritual connection between generations of the family. The dissolution threatened to break that connection. When royal commissioners closed religious houses, removed valuables, dismantled altars, and ended the religious services funded by earlier generations, Darcy saw more than the confiscation of property. He believed obligations to the dead were being destroyed. This helps explain why the conflict became so personal. Darcy's opposition cannot be reduced simply to losing political influence. Religion, local economics, aristocratic identity, and regional authority were interconnected. The same reforms attacked all of them. Cromwell's methods increased the anger. Royal visitors, such as Thomas Legge and Richard Leighton, were sent to inspect religious houses. Their reports described serious misconduct and corruption within monasteries and provided justification for government intervention. Supporters of reform presented dissolution as a campaign against abuse. Opponents suspected that scandal was being exaggerated because the crown wanted monastic wealth. Darcy belonged firmly to the second camp. He saw commissioners arriving from London, investigating northern institutions, criticizing abbots, confiscating property, and weakening local structures that had existed for centuries. At the same time, political speech was becoming more dangerous. The Treason Act of 1534 expanded the government's ability to punish opposition. Speaking or writing against certain aspects of the king's new authority could now have devastating consequences. This changed how disagreement operated. In the older political world, Darcy understood noblemen expected to advise the king. That advice could sometimes be extremely critical. Aristocrats who believed royal counselors were damaging the kingdom might protest directly or organize opposition inside political institutions. Under Cromwell's developing system, hostile words themselves could become evidence of treason. This produced fear. A complaint spoken in a household was no longer necessarily private. Servants, associates, and political enemies could report dangerous statements. Letters could be intercepted. Conversations could become part of official investigations. Darcy increasingly believed that legitimate political opposition was being closed off. Yet his own response went far beyond peaceful disagreement. Evidence preserved in diplomatic correspondence indicates that by 1534, Darcy was already discussing the possibility of foreign intervention. The contact was Eustace Chapuis, the imperial ambassador representing Emperor Charles V. Charles V was not simply another European ruler. He was Catherine of Aragon's nephew and one of the most powerful Catholic monarchs in Europe. His territories included Spain and large areas within the Holy Roman Empire. Darcy communicated secretly with Chapuis about resistance to Henry VIII's religious policies. The discussions eventually crossed an unmistakable line. Darcy considered a plan involving an imperial force landing in England. Once foreign troops arrived, Darcy believed northern nobles could mobilize their own forces, rise against the king's advisors, and move toward London. The objective, as men like Darcy presented it, was not necessarily to remove Henry VIII from the throne. That distinction was important to them. They portrayed the king as a monarch who had been misled by corrupt and heretical advisors. The solution, in this interpretation, was to remove those advisors, restore traditional religion, and return the king to what they considered proper government. Thomas Cromwell was the obvious target. Darcy imagined that military pressure could eliminate Cromwell and reverse the changes being imposed from Westminster. It was an extremely dangerous idea. By any practical standard, secretly encouraging a foreign Catholic ruler to send troops into England was treason. It also reveals that Darcy's later involvement in open rebellion did not appear suddenly in October 1536. He had already been thinking about organized resistance. The foreign invasion never happened. Charles V had too many problems elsewhere. He was engaged in major struggles against France and the Ottoman Empire, and was not prepared to open another military front simply to satisfy English conservatives. Darcy, therefore, remained in England, increasingly hostile to government policy, but without the foreign support he had hoped might change the balance of power. Then, in 1536, the situation in northern England moved beyond private plotting. The government's religious and economic policies had created a much wider coalition of enemies. Some were conservative noblemen worried about religion and political centralization. Others were clergy facing the destruction of their institutions. Others were tenant farmers worried about rents and land. Others feared new taxes, enclosures, or the loss of traditional rights. Not everyone opposed the government for the same reason, but their grievances were converging. In October 1536, unrest erupted first in Lincolnshire and then spread northward. The Northern Rising soon developed into what became known as the Pilgrimage of Grace. Its most important leader was Robert Aske. Aske was a lawyer from a respectable Yorkshire family. He proved capable of organizing a movement that could easily have collapsed into disorder. His greatest political achievement was the way he defined the uprising. He refused to present it as rebellion. Instead, the movement was described as a pilgrimage. Participants marched beneath religious banners, especially the symbol of the 5 wounds of Christ. Catholic imagery gave the movement a shared identity that crossed social divisions. The language was carefully chosen. They claimed loyalty to Henry VIII. Their enemies, they said, were the king's evil counselors. This was not simply propaganda. It reflected a long tradition of political thought in which subjects could claim they were defending the legitimate monarchy while resisting the men surrounding the monarch. The rebels argued, in effect, that Henry's government had been corrupted without claiming that kingship itself was illegitimate. Thomas Cromwell became the central symbol of that corruption. The movement expanded with astonishing speed. Thousands joined: farmers, clergy, gentlemen, former monks, retainers, and local landholders, gathering into a force eventually numbering tens of thousands. Estimates vary, but the pilgrims may have assembled 30,000 or more armed men. The sheer scale of the mobilization immediately distinguished it from an ordinary local riot. This was a fully functioning army. At that moment, Henry VIII did not possess enough troops in the north to defeat it easily. The rebels also produced a detailed political program. Their demands were eventually formalized in the Pontefract Articles. They called for religious and political changes, including the protection or restoration of monasteries, the reversal of major religious reforms, changes to the treason laws, and action against counselors such as Cromwell. To Darcy, many of these demands were familiar. They closely matched the objections he had been making for years, but Darcy now faced a problem he had never faced before. He was not sitting in Parliament. He was not writing secretly to an ambassador. He was inside Pontefract Castle, one of the most important royal strongholds in northern England, and an enormous rebel army was moving toward him. Henry VIII expected Thomas Darcy to do exactly what he had done throughout his career: defend the king's fortress, suppress rebellion, and preserve Tudor authority. Darcy's long military career had been entirely built for such a moment, but this time, the men outside the walls were demanding many of the same things he wanted himself. The old soldier now had to decide whether loyalty meant defending Henry VIII's government or resisting what that government had become. By October 1536, Thomas Darcy was no longer dealing with distant arguments in Parliament or private conversations about religious policy. The crisis had arrived directly at the gates of Pontefract Castle. Pontefract was one of the most important fortresses in northern England. It controlled a major route south toward London and had long served as a center of royal power in Yorkshire. Henry VIII expected Darcy to hold it. For a man with Darcy's record, the order seemed obvious. He was a veteran expected to hold the line, suppress unrest, and keep royal authority intact in dangerous regions. But the reality inside the castle was far worse than London understood. In the weeks before Robert Ascie's army reached Pontefract, Darcy repeatedly warned the government that the rising was becoming much larger than a local disturbance. From September 1536 onward, he sent urgent messages south describing the speed of mobilization and the number of people joining the movement. He asked the Crown for practical support. Darcy requested £2,000 to pay his garrison. He asked for gunpowder, weapons, artillery, and reinforcements. These were not small requests, but neither was the threat. The Pilgrimage of Grace was gathering tens of thousands of men across the north, while Darcy had only a fraction of that number available to defend one of the most important royal castles in the region. London failed to respond adequately. Henry VIII and Thomas Cromwell underestimated the seriousness of the crisis. Darcy's warnings were treated as exaggerated. The money did not arrive, neither did the reinforcements he believed were necessary. When Ascie's forces eventually surrounded Pontefract, Darcy found himself in the exact position he had been warning about. The castle contained fewer than 300 defenders. Many were not experienced professional soldiers. The fortifications themselves had suffered from years of inadequate maintenance. More seriously, the armory did not contain enough ammunition for a prolonged defense. Food was also running short. The situation became even worse because Pontefract had filled with people seeking protection. Local gentlemen loyal to the crown had entered the fortress. Clergymen frightened by the uprising were also inside. These additional mouths rapidly consumed the already limited supplies of food and water. Outside the walls stood an army perhaps 100 times larger than Darcy's effective fighting force. Robert Ascie understood the imbalance. On October 19, he sent an ultimatum to Darcy. The demand was straightforward. Darcy was to surrender Pontefract Castle, open its gates, and take the oath of the pilgrimage. If he refused, the rebels would attack the following morning. According to the threat delivered to the castle, the assault would begin at 8 o'clock. Aske also warned that if Darcy forced the issue into open combat, the result would be the destruction of the defenders and potentially everyone sheltering inside. Darcy now faced a decision that would define the rest of his life. From a purely military perspective, the calculation appeared simple. He could order his small garrison to resist, knowing they lacked enough ammunition, food, manpower, and support. They might delay the rebels briefly, but there was little realistic prospect of defeating them. Or he could surrender. Darcy chose the second option. On October 20, 1536, the gates of Pontefract Castle were opened. There was no major battle. No large number of defenders died. The fortress passed into rebel hands without the kind of desperate siege that Henry VIII expected from one of his senior commanders. Darcy later insisted that his decision was based on necessity. He argued that a defense would have been pointless. Without reinforcements or adequate supplies, the castle could not survive a determined assault. Resistance would merely sacrifice the lives of the garrison and civilians inside, while allowing the rebels to damage or destroy a valuable royal fortress. From the viewpoint of an experienced soldier, the argument had logic. Henry VIII saw it very differently. To the king, Darcy's position as a Knight of the Garter and commander of a royal stronghold created an absolute obligation. He was expected to resist regardless of the odds. The king did not believe that an important fortress could simply be surrendered because the tactical situation looked hopeless. A loyal commander, in Henry's view, should have fought. If necessary, he should have died. The absence of a battle, therefore, became suspicious. Darcy's earlier opposition to religious policy made the situation even worse. His hostility toward Cromwell was known. His conservative religious beliefs were known. The demands of the Pilgrims matched his own political views. The government eventually concluded that the weakness of the garrison may have provided Darcy with a convenient explanation for doing something he already wanted to do. Darcy might still have been able to defend himself politically if surrender had been the only accusation. It was not. Once the rebels entered Pontefract, his behavior changed the case completely. Darcy took the Pilgrim's oath. This was not a minor ceremonial act. The oath identified him publicly with the movement. He also attached the badge of the 5 wounds of Christ to his clothing, openly adopting one of the central symbols of the pilgrimage of grace. For an ordinary participant, that symbol demonstrated religious solidarity. For Thomas Darcy, it carried much greater consequences. He was a member of the Order of the Garter. His entire public identity had been shaped by service and sworn loyalty to the king. Wearing the badge of an armed movement resisting royal policy made it increasingly difficult for him to claim that he was simply a prisoner acting under compulsion. Then he began actively supporting the Pilgrims. The royal armories at Pontefract were opened. Weapons that belonged to the crown were distributed to rebel forces. Darcy also helped finance the movement. Money available in the castle, including royal funds, was used to help pay the rebel soldiers. Darcy contributed from his own resources as well. He was no longer simply allowing rebels to occupy a fortress. He was helping sustain their army. Pontefract became one of the principal centers of the movement. By December, Robert Aske was using the castle as an operational headquarters. Darcy, with decades of experience in government and parliament, became extremely useful to the rebel leadership. Aske was an effective organizer, but Darcy understood national politics at a much higher level than most of the men involved in the rising. He had sat in the House of Lords. He had served on the Privy Council. He understood how royal proclamations were written, how petitions were structured, and how political demands could be presented in language that appeared legitimate rather than openly revolutionary. Darcy, therefore, helped shape the political side of the rebellion. The demands eventually associated with the Pontefract Articles were not simply expressions of local anger. They were carefully formulated arguments against the religious and administrative direction of Henry VIII's government. Darcy's experience was valuable in framing them. This was one of the most dangerous aspects of his participation. A large mob could be crushed and dismissed as disorder. A movement supported by experienced noblemen, lawyers, clergy, and local officials was much harder to ignore. Darcy also began communicating with other powerful members of the aristocracy. Letters intercepted by royal intelligence showed him attempting to influence the Earl of Shrewsbury, whose forces were moving north on behalf of the king. Darcy encouraged Shrewsbury not to treat the Pilgrims simply as enemies. He tried to persuade him that their demands were legitimate and that further military confrontation should be avoided. Darcy later presented these actions as an attempt to prevent disaster. His argument was that the North had already mobilized an enormous number of armed men. If nobody with authority helped control them, the movement could degenerate into looting, private revenge, and uncontrolled violence. By joining the leadership, Darcy claimed he could impose discipline. There was some practical basis for this argument. The Pilgrimage of Grace was unusually organized for a popular rebellion. Ascii repeatedly tried to prevent disorder among his followers. The movement depended on keeping its participants focused on political and religious goals, rather than allowing them to become an undirected armed mob. Darcy's experience would have helped maintain that discipline. But from Henry VIII's perspective, this defense only made Darcy's behavior more serious. He was effectively admitting that he had used his prestige to help organize an army outside royal command. Even if the stated purpose was to limit violence, no monarch could easily accept a subject claiming the right to control tens of thousands of armed men and then use that military pressure to influence national policy. By late 1536, the crisis had reached its most dangerous stage. The royal army, commanded by the Duke of Norfolk, moved north and eventually faced the Pilgrims near Doncaster. The difference in strength was alarming. Norfolk had roughly 8,000 men. Across from him stood perhaps 30,000 rebels. The exact numbers remain uncertain, but the imbalance was obvious enough that Norfolk did not want a direct battle. He privately warned Henry VIII about the danger. If the royal army attacked and lost, the road south could become exposed. The Pilgrims would then possess not only military superiority in the north, but the political momentum created by defeating the king's field army. For perhaps the first time during the crisis, Henry VIII had to accept that force alone could not immediately solve the problem. He needed time. The king therefore changed tactics. Instead of demanding an immediate attack, Henry authorized negotiation. The choice of Norfolk as the royal negotiator was useful. Norfolk himself came from the old aristocracy. He was religiously conservative and personally disliked aspects of Cromwell's reform program. That made him more credible to men like Darcy and Ascii than an obvious agent of Cromwell would have been. In December 1536, Norfolk met representatives of the Pilgrims near Doncaster. The Crown's offer was extraordinary. The rebels were promised a general pardon. This meant that men who had taken part in the rising would supposedly avoid prosecution for their actions. The king also promised that a parliament would be held at York, where northern grievances could be formally presented and considered. To the rebel leadership, this appeared to be a major victory. They had mobilized tens of thousands of men without overthrowing the king. Now the crown seemed willing to listen. Darcy and Ascii belonged to a political culture in which oaths, noble honor, royal seals, and formal pardons carried enormous significance. They believed that an agreement made through a senior nobleman acting with royal authority could be trusted. They therefore accepted the offer. This was the decisive strategic error of the Pilgrimage of Grace. The rebel army disbanded. Tens of thousands of armed men left their positions and returned to their homes for winter. The leadership surrendered its greatest advantage. As long as the Pilgrims remained assembled, Henry VIII had to negotiate with a force too large to defeat safely. Once they dispersed, the balance of power changed immediately. The king no longer faced one massive northern army. He faced thousands of individuals scattered across villages, towns, estates, and monasteries. Trusting the royal envoy's solemn guarantees, the northern lords believed they had secured legal immunity and successfully protected their vast estates from the crown's confiscation. However, this negotiated peace was nothing more than a calculated deception. Henry VIII had no genuine intention of honoring an agreement extracted under military duress. The moment the rebel ranks dissolved and returned to their farms, the promises of safety evaporated, setting the stage for a systematic and brutal retaliation across the northern counties. During the winter of 1536 and early 1537, the royal government used the opportunity well. Loyal forces were strengthened, important positions were reinforced, correspondence was intercepted. Officials began collecting evidence against the men who had participated in the rising. Names were recorded, letters examined, and statements meticulously compared. Darcy's actions at Pontefract now formed part of a growing dossier. His surrender of the castle could be investigated. His oath could be documented. His support for the rebel army could be documented. His letters to other nobles could be examined. His earlier opposition to Cromwell and the religious reforms provided motive. The general pardon appeared to protect him. Then, in January 1537, another revolt gave Henry VIII the opportunity he needed. Sir Francis Bigod, a northern gentleman, launched a new and badly organized rising. The timing was disastrous. Darcy and Robert Ascey did not support Bigod's action. In fact, they strongly opposed it. They understood that renewed rebellion threatened everything they believed had been achieved at Doncaster. Both men attempted to stop the new disturbance. That did not save them. Henry VIII used Bigod's rising as evidence that the North had failed to keep the peace. The king now claimed that the terms underlying the previous agreement had been broken. The promise of reconciliation rapidly collapsed. Martial law was imposed. Norfolk returned north, no longer as a negotiator, but as an enforcer. This time royal forces were stronger, while the huge army that had surrounded Pontefract no longer existed. The repression was severe. Executions began across the region. Participants in renewed unrest were hanged publicly, often in the communities where they had lived. The purpose was not only punishment, but intimidation. The government wanted the North to understand that the period of negotiation was over. Darcy was now in an extremely vulnerable position. The king did not arrest him immediately under the open accusation that the Doncaster settlement had been a trap. Instead, the crown used a more controlled method. Darcy and Ascey were summoned south. The official reason appeared reassuring. They were to come to court in connection with their efforts to oppose Bigod's renewed rebellion. For men who still believed the king might honor the earlier agreement, refusing a royal summons would itself have looked like proof of treason. So they went. Once they reached London, any remaining illusion disappeared. The veteran commander was immediately stripped of his aristocratic dignity, tightly bound, and paraded through the streets on a common trader's cart. He was dragged into the capital, not as a respected regional governor or a privileged negotiator, but as an enemy of the state destined for the harshest possible judgment. Thomas Darcy, the old soldier who had once commanded northern fortresses for the Tudors, was arrested. Robert Ascey was arrested as well. Both were taken to the Tower of London. For Darcy, this was the final reversal of a career that had begun with service to Henry VII nearly half a century earlier. He had entered the crisis as commander of the king's greatest fortress in Yorkshire. He had surrendered it rather than fight an impossible battle. He had then moved from reluctant cooperation to active political participation in the Pilgrimage of Grace. He had helped give the movement discipline, money, weapons, and political direction. Finally, he had accepted a royal pardon and trusted that the government would negotiate. Now the army was gone, the northern leaders were isolated, and Henry VIII controlled the pace of events. Inside the tower, Darcy would soon discover that the crown was no longer interested in negotiation. It was preparing to decide whether one of the oldest servants of the Tudor dynasty had become one of its most dangerous traitors. Inside the Tower of London, Thomas Darcy's case was no longer about whether he had disliked Henry VIII's religious reforms. The government now had a much stronger accusation. Darcy had surrendered a royal fortress, sworn the Pilgrim's Oath, supplied weapons and money to the rebels, and helped their leaders organize political pressure against the crown. His interrogations brought him face to face with Thomas Cromwell. The two men represented very different ideas of government. Darcy believed loyalty between a king and his great nobles involved obligations on both sides. A nobleman served the monarch, raised troops, maintained order, and defended the kingdom. In return, the king was expected to govern within accepted religious and political traditions and to listen to experienced members of the aristocracy. From Darcy's point of view, Henry VIII's government had broken that balance. The destruction of monasteries, the break with Rome, the expansion of treason law, and Cromwell's centralization of power were not simply policies he disliked. Darcy believed they were damaging the kingdom itself. That belief formed the basis of his defense. He argued that great nobles had a duty to warn and, in extreme circumstances, pressure a king who was being badly advised. Cromwell rejected that argument. The Tudor government was moving toward a much stricter definition of obedience. Subjects did not have the right to decide when royal policy had gone too far. They could advise the king, but they could not raise armies, seize castles, or force changes through military pressure. Under that interpretation, Darcy's intentions mattered less than his actions. Whatever he believed about religion or good government, he had joined an armed movement resisting the king. Darcy soon understood that he was unlikely to leave the tower alive. During one interrogation, his anger toward Cromwell finally became explicit. He accused Cromwell of being the principal cause of the rebellion and of the political damage that had produced it. Then he made a striking prediction. Cromwell might succeed in destroying many noblemen, but one day there would still be someone capable of bringing down Cromwell himself. The statement was later remembered because of what happened 3 years afterward. In 1540, Thomas Cromwell lost Henry VIII's confidence. He was arrested for treason and executed on Tower Hill, the same place where Darcy had died. But in 1537, Cromwell still controlled much of the machinery being used against him. On May 15, Darcy was tried for high treason at Westminster Hall. As a peer of the realm, he was formally judged by other nobles. In practice, the political outcome was difficult to doubt. The government possessed extensive evidence of his cooperation with the Pilgrimage of Grace, and Henry VIII had already decided that the Northern Rising required severe punishment. Darcy was found guilty. The verdict did more than condemn him personally. A bill of attainder stripped him of his legal status and punished his family through what was known as corruption of blood. His titles were forfeited, his heirs lost the right to inherit through him, and the crown confiscated the vast estates that had supported the Darcy family's power for generations. For an aristocratic family, this was almost as destructive as the execution itself. Darcy's political influence had depended on land. Land provided rent, retainers, soldiers, offices, and local authority. By taking those estates, Henry VIII ensured that Darcy's family could not easily rebuild the independent regional power he had possessed. There was also a public attack on his honor. As a Knight of the Garter, Darcy had once belonged to the most prestigious chivalric order in England. After his conviction, his symbols were removed from St. George's Chapel at Windsor. His banner, helmet, and ceremonial sword were taken down from his stall. The act represented his formal expulsion from the order and the destruction of the royal honor he had bled for over half a century. The message was clear. The Crown wanted Thomas Darcy remembered not as a former commander, counselor, or defender of the northern frontier, but as a traitor. On June 30, 1537, Darcy was taken to Tower Hill for execution. He was around 70 years old. Because he was a nobleman, he was not subjected to the punishment commonly used against male traitors of lower status, hanging, drawing, and quartering. Instead, he was sentenced to beheading. On the day of his execution, the septuagenarian nobleman, already stripped of his prestigious garter insignia and aristocratic privileges, knelt before the timber block. With a single decisive strike, the executioner's blade ended the life of a man who had spent over 4 decades bleeding for the very crown that now ordered his demise. The axe ended a career that had lasted almost half a century. Darcy had served Henry VII when the Tudor dynasty was still insecure. He had fought against rebels, defended the Scottish border, raised soldiers for campaigns abroad, governed important castles, joined the Privy Council, and entered the Order of the Garter. Now the same dynasty executed him for rebellion. After his death, the punishment continued. His head was displayed on London Bridge, following the Tudor practice of using the bodies of convicted traitors as warnings to the public. His body was buried separately at St. Bodolph's Aldgate. Robert Askey also died. Unlike Darcy, Askey did not receive the relatively quick death of the axe. He was taken back to Yorkshire and executed at Clifford's Tower in York. The government also punished many other participants in the Pilgrimage of Grace. The rebellion was effectively destroyed. The promises made during the Doncaster negotiations did not produce the political reversal Darcy and Askey had expected. The dissolution of monasteries continued, and Henry VIII's government strengthened its authority in the north. Darcy's family eventually recovered part of its legal position. In 1548, during the reign of Edward VI, his eldest son George Darcy was restored in blood and later recognized in the peerage as Baron Darcy of Aston. But the most important thing was not restored. The lands were gone. The crown kept much of the property that had made Thomas Darcy one of the dominant political figures in northern England. His descendants could recover a title, but they could not easily recover the territorial power that had once allowed their father to command thousands of men. That difference explains why Darcy's death mattered beyond his personal story. He belonged to an older form of English government. For much of his career, the monarchy had depended heavily on powerful regional nobles. Men like Darcy maintained armed retainers. Retainers administered justice, defended borders, collected revenue, and controlled local political networks. The king needed them because the central government could not manage every region directly. But this system also created a danger. A nobleman strong enough to enforce royal authority could also become strong enough to resist it. Darcy demonstrated both sides of that system. For decades, his private network helped the Tudors control the north. In 1536, the same experience, influence, money, and military connections allowed him to support one of the largest rebellions Henry VIII ever faced. The Tudor response was therefore larger than simple revenge. Henry VIII's government increasingly reduced the independence of regional magnates and replaced personal aristocratic authority with officials whose positions depended more directly on Westminster. Darcy had helped build Tudor power under the old arrangement. By the end of his life, that arrangement was being dismantled. His own decisions also remain important. It would be too simple to describe him only as a loyal servant who was forced into rebellion. Before the Pilgrimage of Grace, Darcy had already explored the possibility of foreign intervention against Henry VIII's government. At Pontefract, he went beyond surrendering an indefensible castle. He swore the rebel oath, provided resources, and became part of the movement's leadership. Nor was he simply a defender of ordinary people against an oppressive king. Earlier in his career, Darcy had helped suppress popular rebellions without hesitation. When Cornish rebels challenged Henry VII, he fought for the crown. His later opposition to Henry VIII developed because the monarchy began attacking institutions, religious beliefs, and political privileges that Darcy himself valued. That contradiction makes his story more revealing. Thomas Darcy did not suddenly change from loyalist to rebel. The political system around him changed, while Darcy remained deeply committed to an older idea of how England should be governed. For most of his life, that idea was compatible with serving the Tudor monarchy. By the 1530s, it was not. When forced to choose between obedience to Henry VIII and the religious and political order he believed the king was destroying, Darcy chose resistance. Henry VIII answered that choice with the axe. Thomas Darcy therefore ended his life as both a product and a casualty of Tudor centralization. Did this lifelong servant of the crown ever realize that the very royal authority he spent decades strengthening would eventually become the unchecked force that demanded his head?